Hello and welcome to 9 to 5 Data, where we talk about data analytics. In the previous video, we discussed about the visualization pane in the report view. In this video, we were talking about the data view, and in the data view, we'll be looking at the two most important tabs on the data view, which are the table tools and the column tools, and also we'll be looking at something we call date dimension table. So let's get started. But before we start, don't forget to like this video, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you have not. So let's go to our Power BI to look at the table view. So by default, when we get to Power BI, the first thing we always see is the report view. So to switch back to the table view, we just click on the icon under the report view, and this will take us to the table view. So right now, what the table view does for us is that it allows us to see all the data models or something like the data set in our report and the columns that are part of each of the tables or the data set. So by default, the way we see or the arrangement of the column is always based on how the data were loaded into Power BI. So by default, we have the customer table selected, and we can see the customer ID, the city, the state, the latitude. So basically, we can see all the columns that are contained in that table. And if we look at the top on our ribbon, we see that we have a new tab menu that we have never seen before, which is the table tools. And by default, that is selected. And if we click on any of the columns in this table, say for example, we click on customer ID, we have an additional tab menu, which is the column tools. So to go back to the table tools, let's click on the table tools and we'll discuss about the sections of this tab menu. So we have already seen in our previous videos the calculations, and also we have seen the relationship, and the only new things that we have not seen is the structure. So there's not much in the structure. So what it allows us to do is just change the name of the table. Say for example, the name of this table is customers. So you can change it to whatever you want it to be. Say for example, I say customer tables and hit enter. So you wait for it to load and it changes that to customer table. So as you can see on the data pane, that has also changed to customers table. So the other one that is grayed out right now is the calendar, which has the mark as table buttons. So what that allows us to do is that, so by default, Power BI puts together a date table for every date instances in your data model. And the reason why it does this is that it uses this to create what we call a date hierarchical functionality. So for example, in one of the models we have right now, we have the freight, and if I expand that, you will see that we have the date inside this, and by expanding the date, we have what we call date hierarchy. So by default, Power BI creates this, and you notice now that on this freight data model or on this freight table, we now have our mark as table functionality active. But in a proper dashboard development, we don't do this. We don't use the default table. And what we do is that we create something called date dimension. And the reason why we create dimension is that if your data model start to get big, by using the default date hierarchy created by Power BI, it begins to impact the performance of your dashboard. So it begins to get slower. And the way to combat this is by designing or building what we call a date dimension. So by building a date dimension, you'll be able to have a single date table that controls all the date hierarchy in your data model. So let's see, how do we create date dimension? So to create date dimension, we need to use something we've never discussed before, which is the DAX formula. So we use DAX formula to create something we call calculated table. Even though we've talked about calculated tables and calculated columns when we're talking about calculations. So to do that, we click on new table under calculation, and Power BI is going to ask us to write a formula to bring this table to life. So what we usually do is that to do a date dimension, there are two ways of doing that. You can build the date dimension using a static start date and a dynamic end date, or by using a start date from one of your date tables. So we'll look at the first method and we'll say something like, let's come here and name it calendar table. And the DAX formula we'll be using is called calendar. And the calendar functions takes in two parameters, which is the start date and the end date. So like I said, we can put a static start date. So by putting a static start date, we'll just do something like date, and we're going to say what is the year we want to look at. Say for example, we want our date to start like, let's say 2022, and we can put the year to be 2022, and the first month is the month of January, and the first day is 01. So the next thing is that we need an end date. So an end date, we can have a dynamic end date. And to get a dynamic end date is that we want our end date to always be today's date. So what we just do is just use the today function in DAX and then close this bracket. So the moment we hit enter, we have what we call calculated table, and we can see the date we have created. So this will start from 1st of January 2022 to today's date, which is the date I'm making this recording, which is 7th of June 2026. So that is how to do the calculated table, and we can start to add more date fields, like maybe having year, month, year, the day of the date, week commencing. So we can add a whole lot of this, and we are going to see more when we are talking about the column tools. So to get to column tools, we know that we have to select a particular column on our table to get column tools. And to do that, click on this table, the dates on this table. So the next thing is that we have other subsections in this place. And the first subsection that we have here is the structure. So we have the name of that column, which we can change to anything, just like we changed the name of the table. So we also have underneath that, we have the data type. And right now we can select different data type for the column in focus. We can change the data type of the column in focus. And say, for example, this one that we have just created, I think the best data type for this is date, because we don't need the time part of it. So once you select date, then it converts this to date for you. So we can see that the time part of it is already gone. And the next thing again is that we have the next subsection, which is formatting. So for formatting, we have the format, which allows us to set the way this value will look like in a visualization. So for example, we come here, we can change the date format. So we have different date format that we can change. And if I change this to short date, then you can see that the changes will take effect in this place and we'll see a short date. So underneath this place, which is grayed out, we can set the properties or formatting of numerical values. Say we have a number, we can change it to a currency, we can change it to percentage, add comma to separate the thousands value, and also we can have scientific notation to the number. And right now for date, we can't do any of that. That is why this is grayed out. So if we look at something that has number, so let's look for a table that has number. So if we go back to our freight and we click on the invoice number, so notice that this has become active, and then we can make changes to the formatting of the numbers. So which is going to determine how it will appear in a visual. So the next one that we have is the property. So the property allows us to do something like summarization and also work on the context of that particular field or column that we are working with, change the context of that particular field or columns that we are working with. So say for example, the default summarization for a number is always sum. And if we come into this drop down, you can change it to average, minimum, maximum, count, and count distinct. But you can also do don't summarize depending on the aggregation you are trying to do. So most of the time it is always default to the sum, but you can change it to a different type of aggregation, or you can tell it not to summarize. So the data category is also important. So for numbers, it will always be sometimes uncategorized by default. For every data field, it will be uncategorized by default. So for number, you can have something like postal code or barcode. So it will be different when you have a text column in focus. So let's click a text column and see what we have for a text column. So click the city, and then by default, text don't get summarized. So we have don't summarize for text, and then the only aggregation you have is either count or count distinct. And the next thing again is that when we look at the data category, we'll have a whole lot of categories we can put, like address, place, city, country, state or province, postal code, country or region, continent, latitude, longitude, and maybe web URL or image URL. So the reason why this data category is available for us is that if you have a particular visualization that you want to use, by changing the context of that field, we are not changing the data type, but we are changing the context of that field. So it will help the visualization work better. Say, for example, you are using a map visualization. So by setting this to say, for example, this is a city, then it will easily try and locate those cities on the map and give us a better map visualization. So the next one that we have is the sort, and we have the sort by column. So this one allows us to sort a particular column by another column. Say, for example, we can sort this city by the truck ID, and say, let's look at the drivers table. So when we look at the drivers table, we can come here and sort by column. We can sort the driver by the driver ID. So it's just a way of controlling how a field will sort itself automatically when it is added to a visualization. So we need to put that in mind, because sometimes this is very important when we are working with dates. Imagine you want your date to start from Monday to Friday instead of arranging them alphabetically, or you want your month to start from January to February on the visualization instead of arranging them by alphabetical order. So that is for the sort subsection. So we have the groups subsection also, which we can use this to group data. Say, for example, you have an age column or an age field. You can use these data groups to create an age grouping. So if you come here again, you can group a whole lot of things. There are different ways to do grouping, so which I'm very sure when you start doing your own personal development, you would have different ideas to come up with. So the next one that we want to move to is the manage relationship. Even though we have seen this one, but it is very important that when we want to do anything with relationship, we go to the model view. So let's click on the model view, and at this place, we can see how each of our data models are connected to each other, and we can even have a proper arrangement. So this is where we start to do something like data modeling. And data modeling is basically how each of the models, which are the data sets in our Power BI, are connected to each other. So say, for example, we have something like star schema and snowflake schema. So you can bring them together and then see what is the fact table, what are the dimension. So say, for example, now we just created a date dimension. How do we connect this to the already existing models? So let's take a look at this now. This is our freight, which is the fact table in what we are doing. And we can see how other data models are connected to these. So the other thing is that we can fit all the data models to the screen by clicking on this icon at the bottom right, which says fit to page. And then we can then arrange them to have a better understanding of what is happening, and bring this one a bit down. So talking of relationship right now, I've created a date dimension called calendar table. So what I want to do is then connect it to the fact table. So what I do is drag the date and put it on the date on the fact table, and then this new relationship will come up where I can then manage the relationship between the two tables. So the relationship right now, it will tell us from what table to what table. So we are connecting from the calendar table to the freight table, and then it will tell us on which column are we doing the connection. We are doing it on the date column from the calendar table and on the date column from the freight table. And then cardinality is the explanation of the connection between them. So right now the cardinality is one to many. That is, we have unique values of date from our calendar table, and when we get to our fact table, we have many value of dates. There's no unique value of date in our freight table. So that is why we have the cardinality telling us it is one to many. And the cross filter direction is telling us that it is single. So you get an understanding of this when we finish this. And also this is telling us that make this relationship active. So let's click on save. And this is a line explaining the same relationship settings that we saw earlier in that pop-up window. So if you look to the right side, there's a property pane that is also explaining the relationship. We have the cardinality, the cross filter direction, which is single, and the arrow is telling us the direction of the filtering. So we will have filter propagating from the one side to the many side, from the unique side to the many side. So if we change this to both, you will notice that the arrow will change. Let me click on apply changes, and the arrow will change to both direction. So the arrow changes to both direction. So that is, the filter can move from the freight to the calendar table and from the calendar table to the freight table. But in the ideal sense, you should always do single direction, which is one of the things that will improve the performance of your dashboard. So that is for managing relationship, and we have to go back to our table view again to continue the discussion on the column tools. And the last subsection that we have here is the calculation, which is the new column. So this is also something we've explained before, but we have not really seen how it is used. So to do new column, we also need to use DAX formula. And how to do this is that when you click on new column, what you're trying to do, so let me cancel this because I don't want to add it to this place. So let me cancel this. So let me go back to our date table. So go back to calendar and then click on date. So click on new column. So what we are trying to do now is that we want to add some additional column to the existing column in this date table. And one of the column we can add is that we can extract the year from the date and say the column is year. So let's do this. Year equals to, we have a function in Power BI called year, and by reading the definition of the functions, we can see what they do. So for this year function, it tells us that returns the year of a date as a 4-digit integer. So what this need as a parameter is the date. So I'll just put in the date that we have just created from the calendar table and then close it. So when we click on enter, we'll have our year extracted from the dates column. So that is how to use the new column under the calculation subsection. So we have come to the end of this video, and in this video we talked about the important parts of the table view, which are the table tools and the column tools. And we saw how to create date dimension table from calculated tables, and also how to add additional column to that table using calculated columns. So in the next video, we'll start to look at how to import data properly into our Power BI and how to start modeling our data. So don't forget to like this video, share, comment, and if you have not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video. Thank you.